Hi everybody, underwater photography with a compact camera and simple housing and available light, no flash or strobe, is simple, inexpensive, versatile, and fun. We must always remember to reduce the water column by getting close to our subject and trying to stay shallow if possible. And then we need to get a proper exposure and a clear image. We have to focus on the subject and have fast enough shutter speed to stop the action. Well, in this video, I'm going to explain 3 reasons why, in my opinion, using a camera and shooting in aperture priority mode is the best way to do this for underwater photography. In aperture priority mode, you choose the aperture, the size of the opening that allows light to enter the camera's sensor, and the camera selects the shutter speed to get a proper exposure. Now, what are the 3 reasons? Well, 1, you will get a good exposure every time, an image that is not too dark or too light. Okay? 2, by selecting aperture priority, you control your depth of field, how much of your image is in focus. Okay? That's very important. And 3, it's relatively easy. After you set your camera's ISO and aperture, you take the picture, you check the shutter speed on the LCD, on the information, and you see if the shutter speed was fast enough to stop the action, to prevent motion blur. If your shutter speed is too slow, then you have to either open your aperture or increase your ISO. Pretty simple. Let's check out how we set our camera before we go on our dive. Here's how I set my camera up before the dive. Pretty simple. First, I set my camera in aperture priority mode, which the red arrow points to there. Secondly, I set my ISO to a low setting. I might bump it up a little bit if I know I'm going to be in a pretty low light condition, but a low ISO avoids noise, even though it makes our camera less light sensitive. 3, I adjust my aperture to wherever I want. If I'm going to be shooting wide angle, I'll start by having it open, or if I want to have a blurred background, I'll have a large aperture. If I'm going to be doing close focus wide angle, I will make my aperture smaller. And then 3, I set up my LCD screen so I can always view my histogram, which you see in the upper right, but most importantly, I want to be able to immediately see what my shutter speed is after every picture. Now here you can see an image I took underwater, and there you see the green arrow at the left. The shutter speed is only 1/10 of a second. In this case, I was wide angle, very little motion, and I got a pretty clear image. But that's kind of a slow shutter speed. The blue arrow points to the aperture, f4.5, and then the red arrow at the right points to the ISO. My ISO was set at 320. Okay. So I have my camera set up. Now how do I do it? Simple. You focus on the underwater subject, lock your focus, recompose your image, depress the shutter all the way to take the picture. Then we check our shutter speed information on our LCD screen, okay? And we decide, is our shutter speed fast enough to freeze the action, to prevent motion blur? There's 2 things that we have to be good at. 1, we have to know if our shutter speed was fast enough to prevent motion blur. Acceptable shutter speed varies. If there's minimal movement of my camera or the subject, and especially if I'm zoomed out like wide angle, a very slow shutter speed, maybe 1/10 of a second or slower, might be okay to get a clear image and no motion blur. But if there's excess movement of myself or the subject, or if I'm zoomed in, like higher magnification, telephoto, then I'm going to need a faster shutter speed. It might have to be 1/100th of a second or faster to stop the action, okay? That's one thing. 2, we have to then know how to quickly change our aperture and ISO setting on our housing between images to make sure we get a fast enough shutter speed. If our speed is too slow, we can open our aperture at the cost of losing some depth of field, or we can increase our ISO at the risk of getting a noisy image. Now in the next video, I'm going to show some examples of recent underwater images I took in somewhat low light, in some cases anyway, using aperture priority mode. And I'll show you how I do this. Thanks for tuning in.